It's about 3:30. Might as well get started. You need a couple minutes? No. So make sure your phones are silent. There's a handout going around. I think there's some extra copies though. I think we made about 30. Make sure you have one. If you don't have enough, we'll share or something. Our speaker today, Rosa Andújar, is native of New York and a PhD Princeton in 2011 and has been in London, University College London for the past few years on a Levendis Research Fellowship. And she is here to speak with us on Greek tragedy. The title of her talk is Keeping It in the Family, Kinship and Epiphany in Greek Tragedy. So, no further ado.
Great, thank you.
Rosa.
Great, good afternoon, thank you. So just briefly, today I'm going to be presenting material from new work exploring the ambiguous status of the gods in Greek tragedy. And this is a work that initially kind of began as an offshoot of the monograph which I'm currently completing, which is Playing the Chorus, Greek Tragedy Beyond the Choral Load, in which I examined the many roles and capabilities of the chorus, in a way kind of moving away from ode-centered accounts in order to emphasize the experimental dynamism of the chorus as they engage with actors and assume an array of physical configurations. And I should say that I was initially drawn to, in particular, the final scene of the Electra, which I will discuss today in the latter part of my talk, precisely because of its unusual dynamic involving the chorus in dialogue with the god on high. And so again, since then I've just been intrigued by the gods on the stage, basically because they're beings who occupy a liminal space in tragedy, and especially in Deus Ex Machina scenes in which they appear in Epiphany to mortals. Also because they have this function as a didaskalos, sort of this didaskalos figure with the power to shape the play. So, sort of by way of a brief preface. Right, so Greek tragedy is the arena in which the gods burst suddenly into the mortal realm, decisively and irrevocably altering human action. Though the gods are visibly separated from mortals as beings who appear either in Epiphany on high, as Deus Ex Machina, or on an empty stage unseen by mortal characters prior to the start of the drama, their physical interventions can be generally described as having a directorial function, in which the manifesting deity is tasked with reining in the plot or directing its future course. Now, in today's paper, I examine a form of intersection between the mortal and immortal realms that places a distinctive set of pressures on the typical role and dramatic presentation of divine beings. And this is what I'm calling familial epiphany, that is, an appearance by a god who is related to those on stage. So I want to propose this as a valuable concept through which to understand certain closing scenes in tragedy in which divine authority is undermined and in which the intervention of a Deus Ex Machina fails to provide a sense of resolution and order. Now, in order to justify familial epiphany as a compelling category for Greek tragedy, the first part of my paper begins with a brief description of other analogous closing epiphanies in which there is close friendship between gods and mortals on stage. So that's specifically the interventions of Artemis in Euripides' Hippolytus and also Heracles in Sophocles' Philoctetes. In these plays, the eponymous hero's close affinity with the deities who usher the end of the play produces a more personal epiphanic scene, one in which the distinction between mortals and immortals is blurred. So I then discussed the striking manifestation of Thetis before her former husband at the end of Euripides' Andromache, a scene which instantly transforms the general tenor and direction of the drama. So in my discussion, I will demonstrate the manner in which the revelation of these overly familiar divinities complicates and threatens to subvert the impersonal authority that's typically wielded by a Deus Ex Machina. Now, in the second part of my paper, I then turn to the particularly unusual closing scene of Euripides' Electra, in which Castor and Polydelces, the Dioscuri, suddenly appear on high to their distraught niece and nephew, who have just killed their mother, Clytemnestra, the divine twin's mortal sister. In this scene, Euripides unusually lengthens the typical scene of Deus Ex Machina. This epiphany by the Dioscuri is in fact the second longest surviving example of such a scene after Artemis's involvement in the Hippolytus. So after Castor has given a speech that systematically lays out the future for everyone on stage, both alive and dead, Orestes, Electra, and the chorus proceed to question the god, demanding further details of their fate. So assaulted by a barrage of queries, doubts, and laments, Castor, who's still positioned above the stage, is forced into a strikingly lengthy dialogue with the mortals below, one in which he unsuccessfully attempts to calm their various fears. This unexpected conversation, in fact, overshadows the god's original Deus Ex Machina speech in terms of length. So through this series of unprecedented questions and complaints directed to a deity who has made himself manifest, Euripides not only prolongs the moment of epiphany, but he also crucially shifts the balance of power, allowing mortals more control over an experience that typically embodies the awesome power of gods over humans. So through prolonged contact with the divinity, he undoes the promise of rescue which the god's appearance originally offered. So I argue that this scene encapsulates the tensions of familial epiphany because it not only involves deities who are personally related to the mortals on stage, but also semi-divine gods who specialize in saving mortals, and for whom epiphany is the principal modus operandi in their guise as saviors and protectors of humans. The Dioscuri are a living paradox. They are beings whose ambiguous oscillation between dead heroes and gods is made yet more unstable when they are close family members of the characters on stage, and this results in a uniquely volatile closing scene. In particular, as the god's interaction with his niece and nephew is further drawn out, Castor is pulled back and forth between the realm of the mortal and immortal, and the poet makes his role as divine agent of closure questionable by charting the fluctuations in his status. So I argue overall that the epiphany of these ambiguous brothers crystallizes the problem of the god's physical presence in drama. So particularly in the closing moments of a play, divine interventions are one of the most familiar scenes of tragedy, containing recognizable features such as etiologies, instructions, and predictions that line up the plot of the play with other traditions, and which ultimately function to rein in the dramatic plot. However, tragic epiphanies can be far from reassuring impositions of divine and poetic order, but rather shocking and unsettling interventions. And this is notably the case in the Electra, where Euripides stages a scene in which mortals have the capacity to engage directly with the gods, which suggests an active and self-determining role for human agents. Yet the gods are shown to be partly elevated above human affairs, but ultimately feeble, which grimly limits the parameters within which human agency can have an effect. So I propose that this curious mixture of the two, hope and pessimism, is carefully balanced in Euripides and allows a new understanding of the constant but ever-shifting presence of gods in his work and in tragedy more broadly. So ancient Greek gods manifested their power through bodily presence. Their epiphanies to mortals are emphatically corporeal, allowing them to mingle and procreate with humans. Now this physicality, however, rarely figures in critical considerations of the tragic Deus Ex Machina, where they're typically seen as one of the most conventional scenes of Greek tragedy. When scholars of tragedy do treat these scenes as representations of divine epiphanies, as opposed to a convenient literary device, they do not dwell on the precarious status of the deity who appears, and focus instead on questions related to tragedy as a mimetic medium, such as whether these sudden divine appearances in tragedy were seen as true theophanies by the original audience, and whether they should be likewise understood as such. Now, if the status of the divine, particularly as impersonated by human actors, is uncertain in moments of tragic epiphany, it is likely to be more so in the case of familiar epiphanies, where there is close friendship or even kinship between the gods and mortals on stage. It might seem reasonable to assume that the revelation of such a familiar and especially familial divinity is no longer invested with the same sense of awe or terror. More importantly, in a genre which focuses on fate and human suffering in a world dictated by divine will, characters can now directly ask their divine relatives about the justice of the gods and receive less impersonal answers. So scenes featuring familial gods thus have the potential to provide direct and intimate insight into the workings of the divine, at least as imagined by tragedians. So rather than seeing them as anomalous or untragic, they offer a unique perspective into the complexities of the divine and its representation. So there are 3 familial epiphanies in the extant tragic corpus, all found in Euripides. This is Castor's apparition to Orestes and Electra in Euripides' Electra, Thetis' appearances to her ex-husband Peleus in the Andromache, and Dionysus' singular manifestation to his unbelieving cousin and aunts in the Bacchae. But more common in tragedy, though, is the involvement of the familiar divine, that is, gods who were personally known to mortals, such as Athena in Sophocles' Ajax, Apollo in Euripides' Alcestis, and I would argue that these must also be included in the same category of illuminatingly unstable encounters. So for this section of my talk, I'm going to focus on 2 of the most famous examples of such familiar epiphanies, that is Artemis in Hippolytus and Heracles in Sophocles' Philoctetes, which produce a different type of epiphanic scene. So like other deities who speak from the theologeion above the skene in the final scene of a tragedy, Artemis offers authoritative resolution and rectifies any misunderstandings. In particular, she achieves forgiveness between father and son as she clarifies matters to Theseus, namely informing him that Phaedra's accusations of rape against Hippolytus were not true. The goddess's appearance at this final point in the play is not surprising in the least to a viewing audience given her prominence in the play and Hippolytus' own devotion to her. But what is perhaps more unexpected is the manner in which the tenor of the scene changes as soon as the wounded and dying Hippolytus is brought on stage, as you can see on handout number 1. And by the way, there's a lot of text on your handout, I apologize for that. But I will not read most of it, but rather you will find the most salient items in bold or in italics. So in handout 1, the goddess no longer exhorts and commands as she had done a few lines previously with Theseus. Again, this is an excerpt of a much larger scene. But here, she freely converses with her former hunting companion, a large part of which is conducted in a noticeably personal stichomythic dialogue. And this you can see clearly in your handout with the quick succession of back and forth dialogue between goddess and mortal. She even sympathizes with Hippolytus, unusually addressing him as old Telemon at 1389 and 1394, which are in bold in your handout. Such an extended and free interaction between goddess and mortal, particularly one conducted in single-line dialogue exchange, both accentuates and enacts their special relationship, which had been proleptically emphasized throughout the play. Euripides' decision to involve Artemis personally at the close of the play ultimately vindicates Hippolytus, as you can see on handout 2. Where his cult in Troezen is now presented as a positive reward from the goddess. Now, as far as we can tell, Hippolytus was an object of local cult worship in Athens and in Troezen, but connected specifically with the worship of Aphrodite. He was worshipped by young girls, but probably as an implied warning about the dangers of refusing marriage. But this cult was active at least until the 2nd century AD when Pausanias visits. But so now, rather than a cautionary tale that formed part of the cult of Aphrodite, as was traditionally the case, Euripides' Hippolytus is reinvented through Artemis. Now, if Artemis offers vindication to her dying hunting companion, Heracles facilitates Philoctetes' return to Troy and imbues his abandoned friend with a sense of dignity. Now, in Philoctetes, in handout number 3, Sophocles presents us with a divine intervention that is ironically centered on the mortal experience. Though Heracles' speech contains a mention of commands from Zeus at line 14-15, the bulk of it is essentially a personal paranesis directly addressed to a friend in distress. Unlike other gods who continually draw their attention to their divine authority in order to impose their commands on the mortals below, Heracles underlines his own personal connection to Philoctetes from the outset. He has left heaven for his sake, this is at 14:13-4, in order to counsel his friend. Furthermore, though he openly acknowledges his new divinity at 14:20, his former humanity is still key. The new god, for example, stresses his mortal suffering at 14:18-19. Now, arguably, a divine intervention is necessary to break the impasse between Neoptolemus and Philoctetes at the end of this play, especially since Philoctetes refuses to go to Troy. But the particular choice of Heracles enables Philoctetes to go more willingly and even amiably to where mythic tradition dictates, a place which had become more repulsive to the protagonist as a result of Neoptolemus's betrayal and pretense of friendship. Now, Philoctetes' response also radically differs from typical assenting responses, to commands by Dei ex machina, so as you can see in handout 4. So switching to anapests, the hero emotionally admits to have longed for Heracles' voice before even agreeing to obey his friend. So later in handout 5, Philoctetes lists the advice of friends at 1467 as the second of 3 things that bring him to Troy. So after great fate, Megale Moira at 1466, but before Zeus, the all-subduing god who has decreed these things at 1467 to 8. Robert Parker once wrote that the Sophoclean divine is distant and elusive, despite saturating the poet's dramatic world. Now, seen in this light, this rather mortally skewed immortal intervention stands out, particularly as the only surviving divine epilogue by Sophocles. Compared to the only other direct intervention by a god in the extant Sophoclean corpus, namely Athena's Machiavellian involvement at the opening of the Ajax, in which she is heard and not seen by the mortals, which is more in line with the Homeric model of epiphany, Heracles' friendly overtures become even more exceptional. Now, if these familiar epiphanies are able to produce a more poignant dynamic which focuses on the experience of the protagonist, familial epiphanies have the potential to provide more intimate access. The final scene of the Andromache reveals that such epiphanies are also extraordinary in the type of closure that they can offer a viewing audience. Now, in the closing moments of that play, after the death of Neoptolemus is announced, Euripides stages a communal scene of grief between the chorus and Peleus, an antiphonal lament in lyric iambics. This is a komos that reenacts the ritual lament, the phrenos, and contains many of its characteristic elements, including close antiphony, interjections, ritual gestures, and physical manifestations of grief, which you can see on your handout 6, which is a brief excerpt of this larger scene. As you can see there, the emphasis is on the old age of Peleus, who was Neoptolemus' grandfather, and on his lack of descendants to continue the family line. Now, it is precisely at this point of communal and tragic grief that Thetis manifests herself. Unusually, she offers gratuitous consolation and a closure that goes beyond the original drama. The goddess, who is elsewhere preeminent as a mourning figure, helpless for her grief for her son Achilles, now counsels her ex-husband not to be too discouraged by his present misfortunes, as you can see on handout 7, advising him not to be too upset. Thetis seemingly appears only to cheer her former husband, who mourns their dead grandson, and by extension, the extinction of his legitimate family line. Now, in handout 8, she assures a happy ending for both Andromache and for Peleus in a future that takes place well beyond the play. Now, specifically in the case of Peleus, which is at the top of page 3, she promises that she will transform him into a god, the only surviving source in which the mythical figure of Peleus gains immortality. So not only does Thetis quash Peleus' mournful plaints for Neoptolemus, which had dominated this previous scene, but she proposes something quite radical in the mythical afterlife of this quintessential old man, whose troubles in old age was previously the focus of a lost play by Sophocles. Of course, Thetis' involvement has dramatic relevance in a play that's uniquely centered on marriage, and which furthermore takes place in the Thetideon, which takes its name from Thetis' own marriage to Peleus. But her sudden benevolent appearance, and in particular her swift silencing of Peleus' mourning through her promise of a brighter future, instantly transforms the general tenor and direction of the drama towards its precise polar opposite. In handout 9, Peleus instantly desists his mourning, adding that her acts are worthy of herself, when they are in fact not. Again, Thetis' mourning for Achilles was well known in the epic cycle and is hinted at in the Iliad. Her involvement at the end of the Andromache may be cited as a quintessential example of the easy manner in which Deus Ex Machina can usher the end of a play. However, I would argue that such a radical and rapid transition from great suffering and destruction to happiness and even contentedness, precisely at the close of the play, instead prompts the viewing audience to become suspicious of such meddling and ultimately undermines any sense of resolution and closure. Now, I think in an ideal world, I would love to talk about Bacchae, but I'm happy to answer questions about that wonderful play after. So in this section, I have examined several unstable encounters involving both familiar and familial deities, and the manner in which they not only illustrate the internal complexities of these more personal epiphanic encounters, but also complicate notions of tragic closure. Now, in this second part of my talk, I wish to focus on the singular appearance of the Dioscuri and Euripides' Electra, in order to suggest that the involvement of these semi-divine brothers bring these complexities to a boiling point. So briefly, the reasons why they do this is because they are a living paradox. You know, different sources assign different fathers to each brother, and others speak of one brother possessing divinity, or the brothers possessing divinity in alternate days. So not only do they oscillate uniquely between mortal and immortal worlds, but also epiphany is their characteristic mode of action. They appear to mortals precisely at critical points of crisis. So placed in such a context, the sudden apparition of the Dioscuri, especially in the aftermath of their sister's death, becomes more fraught. Do the divine brothers arrive in order to avenge a dead sister? Or do they come to help their niece and nephew at a time of difficulty as their job entails? So in a genre peopled by heroes who are themselves midway between gods and common mortals, it might be expected that this ambiguous and epiphanic pair would have some prominence. Yet the Dioscuri only appear twice in the extant tragic corpus, at the close of Euripides' Helen and the Electra, plays which crucially involve their sisters. Now, though Euripides consistently associates the pair with Helen, and this happens in other plays, including Trojan Women, they do not appear before their famed sister at the close of her eponymous play. Rather, in the Helen, they manifest themselves to Theoclymenus at the point when the Egyptian is about to kill his own sister, making their appearance thematically relevant in the name of brotherly duty. In the Electra, however, not only do they reveal themselves ex machina to their mortal niece and nephew, but they do so immediately as a direct result of the death of Clytemnestra, who is their less famous sister, and with whom they are rarely connected in mythical narratives. At the end of the drama, Euripides presents his audience with a strikingly unique epiphany by gods who are not only epiphanic specialists, but who manifest themselves spectacularly by means of the crane in the direct presence of their sister's corpse, which is displayed in the enkyklema below them. So the play thus concludes with an indelible visual of siblings who occupy completely opposite ends of the spectrum of existence, immortal beings in a lifeless body. Though this tableau may be the only one of its kind in extant tragedy, it nevertheless encapsulates the strange reality of the Dioscuri, as brothers who paradoxically alternate between immortality and death. Now, while the Dioscuri's epiphany presents a singular visual tableau at the close of the Electra, I argue that their manifestation, which critics treat as unproblematic, takes on enhanced meaning when considered in light of both familial epiphany and the wider ambiguities surrounding the Dioscuri, raising in particular crucial questions regarding the play's closure. Euripides summons them at an especially fraught juncture in the drama, in the uncertain aftermath of the matricide, immediately after a scene in which Orestes and Electra suddenly express regret for the killing of their mother. Rather than ending the uncertainty that is opened up by the sudden remorse of the siblings, this prolonged scene of divine intervention instead provides more ambiguity. So Castor, speaking on behalf of the pair, offers a series of platitudes and contradictions that ultimately accentuate the impossible nature of Orestes and Electra's quandary as matricides. The Dioscuri's credibility is furthermore undermined by the fact that the poet continually draws attention to their ambiguous status, both as divine authorial figures and as relatives who are closely bound to the mortals on stage. The failure of these divine figures, who are famed as helpers to humankind, to respond to the concerns raised by their niece and nephew reveals an ironic dimension to the perceived effective meddling of the gods in tragedy. Treating the Dioscuri's manifestation before their niece and nephew and their dead sister as a moment of familial epiphany, however, provides a better insight into both the scene and the pessimistic nature of the play itself. In a drama in which the divine is largely absent, it illuminates Euripides' emphasis on the complicated and incestuous familial dynamics of the house of Atreus, especially as a family in which sibling pairs possess a starring role. Atreus and Thyestes, Agamemnon and Menelaus, Electra and Orestes. By involving the Dioscuri for the first time in this particular chapter of the House of Atreus, a house famed for interfamilial violence, the poet demonstrates the ease with which even the gods can become entangled in the house's nefarious affairs, revealing a claustrophobic and inescapable reality. So the Dioscuri appear after an unusual scene in which the poet stages a steady crumbling of resolve and a growing sense of despair following the matricide, arguably at the perfect time for the comforting solution typically offered by Deus Ex Machina. So in handout 10, the chorus suddenly announced the arrival of Orestes and Electra, who are described as being soaked, Pepurmenoi 1172, in their mother's blood, and presumably also standing before the bodies of both Aegisthus and Clytemnestra under the Enkuklima, which are referred to as trophies, evidence of the wretched slaughters. Now this announced entrance is surprising, particularly when compared to the very same moment in Sophocles' Electra, which you see below. Whereas the Sophoclean chorus clearly find no fault with the bloody deed of Orestes, the chorus's remarks in Euripides are more ambiguous and possibly bordering on the negative. In the scene that follows, the matricides, Orestes and Electra, stunningly express regret for this long-awaited act of, in a shared song with the chorus. Now the song between Orestes, Electra, and the chorus is not a typical lament for the dead, nor a song of victory, but rather Euripides stages a conversation in lyric iambics between the three about the unnaturalness of murdering one's own mother. Now, in handout 11, which again is a brief excerpt of the whole scene, the siblings even reenact their mother's last moments. At 12:14 to 15, Orestes mimes Clytemnestra's last screams and relives the moment at which his sword cut her throat at 12:21 to 23. Now, throughout the whole scene, the language of motherhood plays a prominent role throughout their song. In particular, the verb to give birth, tikto, and the word for mother, mater, are repeated throughout. Whereas the corresponding scenes in the Coephory and Sophocles' Electra generally depict the matricide as the unavoidable conclusion to avenging Agamemnon's murder, in his Electra, Euripides banishes all thought of the much-lamented father as the poet uniquely directs the focus towards the slain mother. This new focus on and sympathy for the dead Clytemnestra as a mother, and rather than as an adulterous wife who's responsible for the murder of her husband, and who is furthermore present on stage as a corpse, suddenly and decisively alters the course of the plot and the viewing audience's understanding of the tragedy enacted before them. It is precisely at this point that Euripides inserts a spectacular announcement of the twins' epiphanic arrival, which is delivered by the chorus and anapests. Now in handout 12, the chorus's proclamation stresses the divinity of the two arriving brothers. But here above the top of the house walk some who are spirits or gods of the heavens. For of mortals this is no path. Why are they walking so openly before mortal men? Now these verses correspond to a dramatization of a religious epiphany. The Dioscuri, whose identity is still not known, are clearly identified as divine beings, either daimones or gods, who are capable of walking or simply appearing, if one prefers the variant Phainousi that's found in manuscript L and P at line 1234. Such a path is plainly not mortal, and the chorus questions why these divinities are choosing to become manifest before mere humans. No less importantly, this announcement establishes an air of solemnity and awe, preparing the audience for an upcoming divine revelation. Now, another similar elaborate description of the sudden arrival and presence of a god occurs in the Andromache, which I have here on the top of page 4 and handout 13. where the chorus likewise marvel at the arrival of Thetis. But look, what is this movement? Which of the gods do I perceive? Look, women, see, is some deity riding through the bright air and dismounting on the ground of horse pasturing Pythia. Sorry, here is some deity. Now, these two are the only two such marked epilogue epiphanies in the entire surviving Euripidean corpus. Which is significant, I think. Now, as with the chorus marveling at the arrival of Thetis in the Andromache, in the Electra, the Anapests announce the transition to a new crucial scene that will involve the appearance of a divinity. References to a divine path in Electra, as well as a deity riding through the bright air in the Andromache, furthermore imply that Euripides made use of the highly theatrical mechane instead of having the gods simply appear on the Theologeon. Yet in the Electra, the Dioscuri are made manifest following the comos between Orestes, Electra, and the chorus, who lament the recently committed matricide at the same time as Clytemnestra's body lies displayed on the Enkuklema. Now, if this was the case, again, then for the final tableau of the Electra, Euripides utilizes the two mechanical devices that allowed him to bring and display off-stage elements before the audience. And as I've said, the simultaneous use of both devices further underscores the vast chasm that divides the divine brothers on high from their dead sister below. Now, despite the overt emphasis on the spectacular nature of this divine epiphany, however, the gods who appear are highly familiar deities. From the outset, the Dioscuri's own kinship with the mortals below is emphasized. In handout 14, Castor, speaking on behalf of the pair, introduces himself in terms of the personal relationships which had grounded the twins as mortals, namely their relationship to their dead sister. In offering this description, Castor repeats various synonyms of siblings. You have twins, Sungonoi at 1239, brother Casignetos at 1240, and sister Adelphes at 1243. Words which pull the god, who was previously established and anticipated as a divine being in the announcement of the chorus, in the direction of the mortal. Now, gods regularly introduce themselves in moments of epiphany, typically as a means to emphasize their divine authority. In this particular case, the divine twins are depicted as still defining themselves in terms of their human relationships. In fact, Castor reveals that the Dioscuri had been doing their divine job at sea until they happened to notice the murder of their sister Clytemnestra at 1241-3. The revelation that the gods' involvement is a rather last-minute decision stands in stark contrast to other Dei Ex Machina, who describe their involvement as messengers of Zeus or commanded by fate. Now, Castor's speech is likewise unusual in terms of his forthrightness. The god, who has just revealed his extensive mortal connections and potential biased outlook due to the last-minute nature of the brothers' involvement, now offers subjective commentary on the matricide, and this is at 1244-6. Her treatment is just, but not your act. And Phoebus, but he is my master, so I keep silent. Wise though he is, he did not proclaim wise things. Now, the repetition of Apollo's name and the subsequent accusation reveal an underlying passion in what is supposed to be a rather matter-of-fact speech. And this aposiopesis, which is extremely rare in Euripides, has been read as both a damning criticism of Apollo and the decision that he made in supporting Orestes' matricide. Which is a criticism that crops up in the Oresteia and also in Sophocles' version, but also as an admission of the demigod's less authoritative status. So I contend that Castor's conflicting comments about the recently committed matricide, and in particular his unwillingness to speak about the oracle of Apollo, can additionally be treated as symptomatic of the tensions that are endemic to familial epiphany, and specifically as a further sign that his mortal side can still powerfully affect the god. Apollo's support for the matricide was a compelling subject for the tragedians. That Euripides directly addresses it through the subjective figure of Castor in such a blunt manner draws attention to his unusual vantage point between gods and men. These candid comments, though brief, begin to undermine an epiphany which had been presented and anticipated with reverence by the chorus's opening anapests. Now, after such an unusual opening, however, Castor's ensuing intervention operates in a similar manner to other Dei Ex Machina scenes. For 44 verses, and this is 1249 to 1291 in handout 15, the God, predicts the outcome of events for everyone who is present on stage. Not only does he specifically instruct Orestes what to do with Electra at 1249, but he also gives a step-by-step account of what will happen to Orestes once the Furies begin to hound him, so starting at 1252 onward. Castor also outlines what will happen to the body of Aegisthus at 1276 to 7, at the bottom of page 5. And at the top of page 5, he also says what should happen to the body of Clytemnestra at 1278 to 80, and so on. Despite the fact that he has just revealed Castor's sympathetic mortal dimension, Euripides now straightforwardly presents him as an authoritative and pseudo-authorial figure who combines dramaturgical and divine power, directing the subsequent course of events and predicting the future for everyone on stage. This contrast between emotional semi-divine God and omniscient deity illuminates the tensions of familial epiphany. Now, in general, Euripides' gods do not interact with mortals. Their involvement is brief, yet decisive. Usually, after such a speech, uttered by a god on high, the mortals on stage may offer a few words of acceptance, but invariably, everyone promptly exits the stage. Here, Euripides chooses to transform the moment of revelation into an opportunity for conversation. Now, someone on stage, and in Diggle's text, it's the chorus, but in Martin Kropp's text, it's Orestes, so either chorus or Orestes, initiates a dialogue with the god. Sons of, at 1292 to 3, Sons of Zeus, is it permitted for us to approach you in conversation? Now, again, there's scholarly disagreement as to who speaks for the chorus of Orestes, and this is also what initially drew my attention to this scene. But in any case, to approach a god and to engage him in a conversation after an epiphany is a remarkable thing to do. To ask him challenging questions, however, is unheard of, particularly when the god is demanded to explain their lack of prior involvement, and this is at 1298 to 1300. Why, being gods and brothers to this dead woman, did you not ward off the goddesses of death from the house? Now, whether posed by Orestes or the chorus, this question underlines the ambiguous position of the Dioscuri and their unusual involvement as familial deities, both gods and brothers. To the humans on stage, the Dioscuri possess a dual role and obligation to them as gods and as brothers of Clytemnestra. The god is quickly dragged into mortal conversation, and he switches to Anapes in his response, again reverting to a biased view. He offers both platitudes and blame for Apollo. He says at 1296 to 7, to Phoebus I ascribe this bloody deed, and also at 1301 to 2, destiny and necessity led you to what must be, along with the unwise words of Phoebus' tongue. Encouraged by the fact that Castor actually responds, the siblings continue their interrogation of the god and further press him, asking specifically what Apollo and what oracles decreed the matricide at 1303 to 4. Castor, however, continues speaking in tired cliches. He says at 1305 to 7, shared acts and shared destinies. It was a single doom that destroyed you both. When pressed by his niece and nephew as to why the matricide was necessary, his awkward responses spark more intense questioning. His failure to provide an answer for his sister's murder underlines the god's fundamental ignorance, which provokes the siblings to descend into a lengthy joint lament at 1308 to 41 in handout 17. Now, this joint lament by Orestes and Electra not only ignores the gods who are present before them, in a silence that Castor repeatedly and without success tries to break with interjected, hackneyed commentary, which I've highlighted at 1311 to 3 and also 1319 to 20. But it also swiftly returns the audience to the same, to the same uncertain place as in the previous scene prior to the Dioscuri's apparition. Though the ignored Castor even attempts to reassert his divinity in the middle of their laments at 1327 to 30, his failure to provide an appropriate response to the siblings' subsequent snub ultimately reveals a rather prolonged interaction with a god that results not in clarification or illumination, but rather in confusion and lack of knowledge. As the scene draws to a close in such uncertain terms, Euripides includes another moment of reassertion by Castor as divine figure in handout 18. The poet reminds us of the directorial role of the gods, as Castor, switching to the iambic trimeter, swiftly brings Orestes and Electra's lament to an end with a sudden impersonal proclamation. These two will tend to their marriage at 1343. Now, he cites the hounds of the Furies himself at 1343-6, which in previous versions were only privy to Orestes. So Castor then suddenly underlines he and his brother's role as Theoi Soteres. Using the duel for the first time at 1347-8, where he says no sosonte, and then also at 1349 ste conte, Castor states the brothers' important function as saviors at sea. He works hard to emphasize his and his brother's divinity, as if to dispel any doubts that may have arisen in the course of his conversation with his niece and nephew. And in fact, he ends with an emphatic declaration of his own divinity. Thus I, a god, declare to mortals. Yet this nervous moment of reassertion underlines the fact that the moment of salvation has been undone. Even the Dioscuri, who strictly operate in epiphanies and thrive in moments of difficulty and crisis, have in a sense failed to bring order and closure to the house of Atreus. Such a scene, which accentuates the twins' familial and divine obligations, becomes more extraordinary given that throughout the play, Castor was not only related to Electra, but he was in fact also her original betrothed, and this is in handout 19. Now here, Euripides intimately implicates Castor in the drama, and he establishes a variety of personal connections and affinities that potentially undermine his role as manifest deity. So the world depicted by Euripides and his Electra is thus one of the most claustrophobic and extant tragedy. Even the gods who manifest themselves in order to resolve the crisis are shown to be equally implicated in the deadly mortal affairs. Now the gods are summoned onto the tragic stage, typically to solve what is humanly unsolvable. Their entrance heralds the eruption into the mortal world of a force that lies beyond its usual horizons. In Euripides' Electra, however, a drama of interfamilial violence, everything remains in the family. The Dioscuri, whose signature activity is epiphany in moments of crisis, are shown to be unable to dispel the uncertainty that's created by the remorse of the matricide. This reveals a hopeless situation which remains impervious to the closure that is typically achieved by Deus Ex Machina. In addition to denying a sense of resolution that might be expected from the involvement of the gods, my final contention as I conclude is that Euripides' use of a familial epiphany sheds special light on his Electra, a play which has been much maligned in the history of ancient Greek tragic criticism. Now, this is the only scene in which a Greek tragedian attempts to resolve directly the aftermath of the famous matricide of Clytemnestra by her son Orestes. The involvement of the Dioscuri produces a sense of claustrophobia, revealing a pessimistic nature of what is considerably a reassuring domestic and character-driven drama. In a play that's otherwise distinguished by the absence of the divine, this sudden closing turn to a Deus Ex Machina might be unexpected, but my focus on familial epiphany allows us to appreciate this novel ending as a reflection of the play's emphasis on the familial. So rather than seeing it as a reductive or risque version of Aeschylus' or Sophocles' dramas, Euripides' Electra dares to solve the problem of the house of Atreus as internally as possible. Though the play begins with a broken and dysfunctional family in which all the members are separated, the only version in which the siblings are all living away from the house of Agamemnon, the drama takes place within a deeply intimate familial setting in which all characters are connected to one another by blood or marriage. The sudden appearance of these uncles ex machina reflects a confined world in which even the gods cannot escape these deadly mortal associations and concerns. Whereas Aeschylus outsources the problem of the matricide to Athens and its civic gods in the Eumenides, and Sophocles lets the subject fester unresolved, Euripides offers the house of Atreus' own unique and familial gods as saviors. However, Castor's failure to respond to the legitimate concerns of his nephew and niece, to whom he was formerly betrothed, illustrates that divine order in the world of this play is tenuous and fragile. Now, most surviving tragedy is notably centered on the sufferings of a singular oikos, or a group of closely knit individuals. According to Aristotle, family conflict lies at the emotional heart of Greek tragedy. In the final item on your handout, this number 20, he discusses familial confrontation as among the genre's most terrible and pitiable incidents, identifying in particular atrocities that were committed by and to brothers or between parent and child. Now, if we were to conceive of the tragic universe in spatial terms, operating on a two-dimensional plane, then the human dimension would occupy the wide lateral axis, a significant portion of which would consist of familial relations. In this model, the gods, as omniscient beings who dictate the terms of all action, would naturally inhabit the vertical plane. If tragedy transpires within the field of tension that's demarcated between these axes, however, the personal involvement of familial gods in certain plays creates moments at which the structuring principles of all tragedy, its horizontal and vertical dimensions, bend towards and threaten to collapse into one another. Thank you very much.
We have time for questions. Actually, I had one.
Yeah, please.
So you mentioned in the beginning that the divine epiphanies and presumably other tragedies are impersonal. You refer to them that way? Is that right?
Well, in the sense, they're quite brief, and I mean, you basically have, they tend to be, a god delivers a speech, there is a brief assent, or the mortals on the stage will agree to follow the instructions, and that's it. The end. So and in that speech, sometimes you have a lot of things like ideologies, the establishment of cults. You basically have all kinds of ways in which the loose ends of the drama are tied up. But the bulk of these speeches tends to be the long speech by the god, and then the assent of the mortals. And that's what I meant. So there's no opportunity for conversation as in the Electra or even in the Hippolytus.
Okay.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you. I enjoyed that. Going back to what you were saying about the gods appearing in the presence of a corpse in the Electra, it brings us to that bête noire of people who study divine epiphanies, namely Medea, because she also appears in the presence of corpses. Of course, there are also members of her family.
Of course, yeah.
She then has a long dialogue with a member of her family.
Absolutely.
So how does what you're telling us, which I found very persuasive, help us better understand what's happening in Medea?
Yeah, no, I think Medea, absolutely. I think it takes enhanced meaning if you look at it as kind of a familial epiphany. And I would say this is the same thing for Bacchae as well. I think part of what makes it so catastrophic is the fact that you have this vengeance enacted within sort of the confines of your own family. And I think that's why with Medea, I mean, especially her own children, I just think that basically that's what makes the drama so powerful. And sort of to add a little bit, to think a little bit about Bacchae, which I didn't talk. I mean, I'm a play which obviously fascinates everyone, including me. I think in a way with that play, thinking it about in terms of familial epiphany, also kind of allows you to appreciate again the immense power and also the novelty of what Euripides is doing. Because Dionysus is kind of taking revenge against lots of people. That's what he does. In fact, I mean, we had a lost tetralogy by Aeschylus on the Lycurgeia, which was basically focused on Lycurgus of Thrace, who also, like Pentheus, decided to ban the god's cult. But what I mean, obviously we don't have that play, but I would imagine if it were to survive and we were to put it side by side to the Bacchae, I think the Bacchae would still emerge as more sort of powerful and sort of shocking of all those plays, precisely because of sort of the enactment of divine vengeance within, again, the confines of your own family. So I would include Medea.
Does it help us understand? What really snagged my attention is what you said, which I found persuasive, about Castor and Polydeuces are not normal.
Well, they're...
So one of the ongoing arguments, of course, is Medea really a god?
Right, exactly.
Is she immortal? So where would this help us stand? Or does it really leave us in the same
Well, it's so quite different. I mean, I think, right, obviously there is this question of sort of what is Medea's current status at the end of the play. She appears on high, like a god, but she's not quite, I mean, obviously she does have divine, she is descended from the gods. But with the Dioscuri, I mean, I think what makes this moment so compelling is, again, the fact that they are unusually amongst even the sort of the anomalous sort of semi-divine gods, they stand out because of this idea of them sharing divinity. So I would say that with the Dioscuri, I mean, especially the fact that sort of Euripides charts all the fluctuations in that status, that in a way is much more powerful than what you see in the Medea. And I don't know, I mean, I think it's, I mean, I'm just fascinated by the Dioscuri, and I always, whenever, I mean, one of my favorite stories about them is sort of, that wonderful thing in Lucian in the Dialogue of the Gods, where Apollo and Hermes are trying to make sense of these weird gods. And the fact that obviously through their Philadelphia, through their brotherly love, they decided to share life and death at the same time. But yet, they never got the thing which is what they wanted the most, which is to see each other. But also they discussed the paradox of how do you identify or distinguish twins who are never seen together at the same time. I just think that the Dioscuri, especially, I mean, Medea is, I think especially, well, I mean, in that play, especially as Euripides is kind of rewriting certain things, the involvement of the Corinthians, and which in a lot of other mythical narratives had killed the children. I think it is quite shocking what he does with her. But I think I'm just sort of fascinated by these figures that occupy such a liminal space in the ancient Greek religion, world of ancient Greek religion, and they only appear twice in the tragic corpus, and again, in such an unusual way in this play, with such a prolonged sort of exposure to them. So, yeah, thank you. Yeah, Ben?
I was going to ask you first about the appearance of the Dioscuri and Helen, because there too, they present a kind of non-solution.
Yeah.
In fact, these two are not going to stay together after they've been falsely separated all this time. They're reunited, but in fact, she's going to become one of them.
Sorry, so Menelaus and Helen.
Menelaus and
okay.
Helen. In fact, Helen will become one with them.
Yeah.
So it's it's almost...
Yeah, but at some future point, because I think in that play, I mean, I think what a lot of that play is looking forward to, especially her interactions with that weird Greek chorus that just happens to be in Egypt. Yeah. A lot of it is sort of looking forward to when she will be reinstated in Sparta as a choral leader. So I think that is probably suggesting to some other later point when she will be some kind of a deity, but she still has this intervening episode where she has to go back to Sparta and be wife to Menelaus and mother to Hermione and be resume her function as the choral leader of Spartan Parthenae choruses. So I think but it is interesting to think about.
And there too, there's sort of associated with shipping. The odd idea that they were doing the thing.
Yeah, and they
happen to see the sea back.
Exactly, but they appear only to the Egyptians. Helen and Menelaus have already long gone, so you don't see the interaction between them and their sister. But exactly, it's the same thing. They just so happen to. Yes, it's fascinating, I think. But again, that's a much shorter. Even though it's sort of rather unusual in the way that they also happen to announce it matter of factly that they just happened to notice what was going on. It still kind of operates in many ways like other moments of Deus Ex Machina. They sort of stop something, a course of action, and then everybody agrees and plays over.
I want to ask you a very small question.
Yes.
I've never thought about this before. In the first chapter earlier in the first line, earlier in the play, Aphrodite has said that Hippolytus has come upon an association that is greater than mortal in her prologue. And he then has this odd relationship with Artemis, where they're companions, but they don't quite associate. Do you think that to an audience that's been sort of watching this play and pre-prepared by these lines, Hoia sum fora tsuges might not appear as planned? Because the sunzalunumi is a fairly standard image of marriage.
Yeah, actually.
So that it kind of sustains, it keeps that same idea. It's a relationship that somehow shouldn't have.
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely possible, especially when Artemis later on kind of mentions the fact that the reason why Aphrodite chases him is because she hated his chastity. So yeah, no, I think that's quite clever. I like that. Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah, thank you for that.
I had something that was related to that. This was very stimulating and made me think of the aspect of affinity, not only familiarity, familiar, but affinity between the god or the deity and the person they appear. And so I was wondering of how these two things, thematically things go together, or if you know the cases, for instance, in this case when you mentioned how the Dioscuri appeared in the Helen, not to Helen,
but to
the relative, but to this other guy, because they're emphasizing the brotherhood, and in the play here of in the Electra, obviously they're emphasizing again and again, not just that they're not that they're siblings with Clytemnestra, but I was wondering more if the emphasis is on the fact that Electra and Orestes are siblings, and they are siblings, so emphasizing that relationship, and he's responsible for her. So then that made me think how at least in a couple of cases, I could see this kind of affinity. Artemis and Hippolytus as hunters and virgins. And obviously Hippolytus is the son of Amazon. But also I thought, well, Heracles and Philoctetes.
They're friends.
They're deranged, solitary, isolated people, warriors in these extreme kind of types of isolation from regular society. And that's where, as far as I got. I was thinking that this is a person. Those things, I mean, I don't know. But do you see that working together, or in as a different register? Because I should say I'm generally interested in these types of relationships, and so especially familial dynamics and tragedy generally. And I think there's been some attention recently. There's been a couple of articles about this. Mark Griffith has this wonderful article on Orestes and the in-laws, about Euripides' Orestes, and just clarifying all the relationships that are at work in that play. And there's also Lindsay Koo talks about this lost play of Sophocles, about sort of the tale of two sisters. So there's something about the way in which attention to siblinghood and to sort of these close affinities is kind of the focus of a lot of tragedy. So I do think there's something there. But what I hadn't seen, what struck my attention, obviously, sort of in the more extreme case, are these sort of affinities across these divides that are supposed to be, fixed and a major part of the world, of the way that the world is ordered. And I think, I don't know, with the Dioscuri, I mean, I do think, I think I made that point about just the general House of Atreus emphasizing siblings. And I do think it's quite remarkable that, this pair of siblings appear, they come and appear before a pair of siblings in the last chapter of, of siblings who have committed atrocities. So I think that is definitely relevant. I don't know if that, but no, I think all the siblinghood, and I think all the stuff, attention to familial dynamics, I think is something that's, I think is quite profitable, thinking about tragedy in those terms, and I'm quite intrigued. I mean, this is something that's quite new. It's quite new to me. This is something I've been sort of exploring more recently, but I don't know. I hope to continue sort of meddling with it further. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Richard. I just follow up on that. The siblings, I mean, these are two kind of related things, but I was in the way in which, so passage 10 and passage 12, so the way in which the chorus describes the entrance of Electra and Orestes, like being completely mirrored by the language in the way in which the Dioscuri are mentioned. And the Bainusi there, either being... the Bainusi, And I guess I was thinking about, without there's something that prepares you for something that isn't an epiphany until you get to the moment where you actually know that they're gods. And I was kind of curious about that, especially, compared to the Andromache passage where, flying through the air, there's some kind of element of when epiphany is actually kind of revealed. So I was wondering whether just in that entryway there was a kind of a playing down, just very, very subtly playing down of their divine status at that moment. And I was wondering whether that was because, and this goes back to the passage where there's the debate about whether it's the chorus or Orestes in passage 16. Is one of the problems here that Electra is breaking rank somehow? with her brother in the way that she exchanges.
Yeah, that is.
I mean, I find the line 1303 really, you know.
Yeah.
What Apollo?
Yeah,
You know, I mean,
yeah.
That's like that moment in Aeneid where it's like, is it a god that instilled this in me, or am I making something a god? You know, what are you telling me? Are you telling me Apollo made me do something? And even like, and then when I'm reading that comes back to, as you trace the kind of history between Castor and Electra. So actually there's this weird sense in which she's kind of more familiar
with
in
him.
a way that and Orestes is kind of trying to kind of go with it a little bit more, while she's kind of resistant in this way that. So I was wondering about like the idea of having the setting up sameness in order to just kind of show that friction between the two siblings in the act.
Yeah, no, interesting. So I'll take, I guess, your last point. So addressing handout 16 first. I mean, I think part of the problem what's happening here is, I find what you're saying very suggestive, the idea of Electra breaking rank and sort of her more overt familiarity with the god being what's really behind here. But I think most people just object to the fact that the chorus, or sort of, I think what's happening here actually is that the manuscripts have Orestes saying, as sons of Zeus is permitted. It's Orestes, yes. But I just included Diggle's text. But it's Orestes. The manuscripts list Orestes as saying this, but people have a problem with Castor's response. Oh yeah, you can approach, you can talk to me. You're not defiled by these murders. Yeah. What? Like what?
But that's great. That works in terms of like, you're fine, and then Electra's like, yeah, you're fine too.
Well,
it's Apollo's.
Yeah, no, but the thing is also note. I mean, so the thing is, if you read it from there, then you go to 1295. Then I think if he says yes, Orestes, you can talk. Then. And I think Krop, and I'm sure I think Kovacs is the same thing in the Loeb, then they just revert back, they just stop reordering the lines. So they go back, so after Castor says you're not defiled by these murders, then you have Electra, oh, can I also talk to you? And then it's a whole exchange just between the siblings with the god. But I find what you're saying suggestive, that if it is to be the chorus, then there's something about Electra doing something different and sort of kind of like singling out her own overt familiarity with that god. I have to say, I still don't know. I mean, it's just there's so much going on here. And I think most people who talk about the ending of the Electra just basically focus on what Castor's saying about Apollo and trying to make sense of but I just think also just the general dynamics of the scene. I don't know. I mean, I think familial epiphany does help explain what's going on, but I don't know if I've quite worked out what's going on. And with regards to your other points about these announcements, I mean, I wouldn't say that they detract from, the divinity. I mean, from the sort of arriving divinity. Again, I think, I don't know if I emphasize this enough. These are the only two. I mean, there's only three marked or sort of announced epiphanies in Greek in the surviving corpus of tragedy. These two moments, and in the Heracles, in the middle of the play, when Lysa comes in, which is already unusual by its very position. So these are the only two. Examples that we have of epilogue divinities who are explicitly announced with such a spectacular way. So I think that and I think also the use of I think what they're doing is just basically showing you, or giving you a kind of stage direction. Here is the crane being used, That's what I think is happening. And I don't think that would have taken away from the impact. I think if anything, people are being prepared, the audience is being prepared for something quite spectacular, some major god arriving. But hey, in the end, it's someone the characters on stage actually knew, which is fascinating. I don't know if that answers.
I just the beginning of the second line there. First line, you don't know what's happening. I mean, you don't.
Well, this is the exact, no, you're right. And so you were talking about the Binusi. The Binusi. Look, someone's walking. No, you're right. So sorry. In the chorus's announcement of the Electra. I guess they do say the ones who are, soaked in their mother's blood. I mean, that's pretty, who that is. But you're right. But there's this, the Binusi is later echoed in the announcement of the Dioscuri. And there's also obviously, there's an announcement of someone kind of exiting or coming out of the scene, onto the stage. But there's also the announcement of there in the chorus handout 10 of the enkuplema being used, and this trolley's being wheeled out with these bodies, which is fascinating when you think about in this play, in the Electra, how much attention is being paid to these mechanical devices that are bringing all this offstage action. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
I was actually wondering if you had any insights as to situations where the God that comes in could very easily be familial, yet that opportunity is not taken, such as an ion.
Oh, I love the eye.
Yeah, but where Ion is on his way to the oracle to ask whether or not Apollo is really his father,
Yep.
and I believe actually even does have an announcement of the God.
Yeah. No, yes.
Saying, oh my God, there's somebody coming, we should like run away.
No, but he says, I think it's like, oh, it's something about the sun. I think he I can't remember the exact words, but
Yeah.
there's some intimation of like the sun god or some bright deity arriving, and it's almost like, oh my God, at the moment where he wants to, confront his father, his father is going to appear, but no, it's Athena.
Yeah. So, it's interesting.
Yeah, who is his aunt, but obviously she appears in the guise, I think, as the protectress of the city of Athens. I mean, there's no personal connection there.
Right.
But-
It's just interesting where you have this opportunity that really gets set up perfectly, and then all of a sudden a God that you would not expect
Yeah.
shows up instead, and yet it's still a God that's somewhat, connected, Carissa and Athens and everything.
Yeah.
But at the same time that there's more distance, and I'm wondering if that has to do with, that a God that is sort of, one of the top 12, like Apollo, whether or not it's he, for some reason, has more difficulty coming in and coming down with a, personal relationship. I mean,
Yeah,
sure,
well,
rescues,
he's very well,
but the
yes.
relationship is a bit more distant, though,
Yeah.
as far as the relationship goes. So I'm just sort of wondering-
Yeah, I mean, the way I read that play is basically the promise of a familial epiphany. The whole scene is set up to promise. You think. You read the things that are being said suggest that Apollo's about to appear and confront his son. How amazing is that? And then, oh no, it's Athena. So I just read that basically as sort of expectations being subverted, by Euripides. The Orestes is fascinating. I mean, I think obviously, yes, Apollo does appear there, but the whole, that play is amazing. The whole thing, the spectacular nature of that play, the fact that you have a double epiphany. I mean, you have the whole thing. I mean, Orestes appearing on the Theologion, first of all, and kind of talking to Menelaus below as though he is a god. I mean, he talks to him in these negative injunctions like other, I'm sure you can tell me this better than anyone, sort of analyzing all these scenes. I mean, he talks like a god, Orestes, but then of course, Apollo then appears even above him on high through, so I mean, the Orestes, and the thing is also he appears with the silent Helen, who is obviously related to Hermione and to very many people on stage. But I think that stage is basically, that plays much more about just the spectacular nature of the, of the function of the Deus Ex Machina. Although it is fascinating that Apollo, in a way, in that play, kind of has to talk twice, tell people twice what to do. He first tells Menelaus, Orestes, stop fighting, and then actually go leave the stage. I mean, he kind of gives these two separate speeches, but yeah. So you have the whole doubleness, and it's I think it's just much more about stressing the spectacular, what you can, I think it's a Tragedian kind of bragging what he can do with this spectacular device. Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, Tom?
Throughout your talk, you've really been stressing nicely the intimacy of these relationships, and you spoke in terms of things like claustrophobia.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could say anything about, or if there's anything to be said about the rupture and the impersonality of this through the mechanisms of epiphany in which a character, say Philoctetes, is presented with his dear friend, but now in a different way. We're no longer having the same sort of relationship. Uncles show up, but now it's on a very different level. And I'm thinking about, moments such as when Demeter reveals herself in American to Demeter, or even mythical storylines such as the marriage of Peleus and Thetis, these moments where you get ruptures. And in some ways you could say that many of those ruptures are about establishing cosmic order, the relationship between divinity and humanity, mortality and immortality. Is there something along those lines that's going on with these stories about cosmic order, or even geopolitical order rather than...
Yeah, it's an interesting. I mean, I think in the examples, I think of the Heracles again, and in this case in the Electra, I would like to think that that's, in theory, I think that's what you would expect. But if you, again, analyzing closely what's going on, especially the fact that the way in which the gods present themselves to the mortals is not unlike, it's not like I am so and so and blah blah blah. They're still defining themselves in terms of their mortal relationships. I think that's quite unusual. And this is why, again, I think what drew my attention to sort of, thinking about this as a special category. I think in a lot of other, think about even in the art, Artemis's appearance in the Hippolytus, which is obviously lengthier than this thing in the Electra, but that's partly because the first half of it is basically her talking to Theseus. And that is all about sort of imposing, an order into the world. I mean, he has unleashed this, the Poseidon's curse onto his son, and she, I am Artemis, this, here's what you have to do. And then things kind of get lengthened by bringing in Hippolytus, sort of, he's wheeled out, and then he has this like extended interaction with the goddess. But I think in a lot of other scenes, that seems to be the case, sort of reimposing this sort of divine order, but not in these particular cases. And it's funny you mentioned Demeter, because I think there was a play by Sophocles, the Triptolemus, that may have involved her appearing as an epiphany to the child that she looked after while Persephone was gone. We don't know. We can just, I have a good friend who works on sort of fragmentary Sophoclean plays, and she said that we have no real evidence other than we think Demeter was probably involved. But that would have been amazing. Because the child that she looked after, I would have loved to see, if there is such an epiphany, I would love to see what that would look like, especially with someone like Demeter. But yeah, no, great question. Thank you. Yeah.
I think that both the cosmic order and both familial connections can go back to Homer. I think of like when Zeus is considering whether he should save Sarpedon.
Yeah.
I guess that could almost be like an aborted epiphany, since he's talking with her and whoever else. I can't remember who he's talking to exactly. But he says, should I go down and save him, like Aphrodite does with Priam, and with Paris? And he said, no, we can't do that, because if I do that, then it's
absolutely.
The fabric of the Earth, or the universe rather. Also thinking about Ino in Book 5 of the Odyssey. Yeah. It's kind of weird that she comes in to save Odysseus instead of Athena. It's sort of like Odysseus is standing in for her son Melicotes, who dies when she jumps into the sea with him.
Yeah, no, I think that's very suggestive, and I think generally, it also makes you think about the way in which these things operate in the world of Homer. You basically have deities who are only heard, or who are in disguise. Obviously there's a special case of Thetis and her son, but you could argue that throughout the Iliad, Achilles is kind of held up as more than a human. So that is not really operating like a normal epiphany. And I think Laura Slatkin kind of analyzes the speeches of Thetis to her son and say that this is actually something completely other. This is not the way that immortals talk to normal mortals. So, but no, definitely. I think this is, again, for me, I think I would like to going ahead, I would like to sort of continue exploring all these, all these sort of all the sort of the rich and varying ways in which the divine is represented in Greek literature. Because I think there's a lot of weird contradictions and liminal spaces, and I don't know, places where you can go in and play and make sense of of all these sort of paradoxes that are being underlined. Well, thank you.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to follow up one thing about Calypso. It's a weird one. So I was just teaching today that Calypso, it's the first time Odysseus speaks, and he basically asks Calypso not, she's saying, yeah, sure, you're free. And he's like, I don't really buy it. I don't really, prove to me, swear an oath that I'm actually free. And she laughs at him and says, okay, I'll swear an oath. As if it's, you are talking to a goddess here, and you are talking to someone that you've just spent a year with. There's this weird sense of, it's an amazing moment of familiarity and of and of a character that says, that basically kind of offends the deity by their willingness to say, I don't trust what you're doing. And obviously we have records of this in various epiphanies, American to Aphrodite, the most obvious example of where you're not trusting that someone's actually a goddess in front of you is fine. But you've got this weird thing of familiarity, not in terms of a relationship, but a particular kind of relationship that then breeds a certain kind of suspicion. And there's something interesting happening right at that moment. That's the first exchange we get between Odysseus and anyone. And it's this testing of these kind of boundaries at that moment. Anyway.
No, thank you for that. I mean, I think I hadn't really thought of it, but I think, I think you're right. I think there's definitely something unusual going on there.
I like your term instability now. And listening to Richard especially made me wonder, isn't instability in a way inherent in most epiphanies, except where the context, let's say, Asclepius in Epidaurus, makes it clear it's not unstable. But that's not anyway my question. My question is a very different one. Could you use instability of epiphany as a tool to understand the Amphitryon?
Sorry, to understand
the Amphitryon.
I have to say, what was the last time I read that play? Let me see. I've just been teaching Greek comedy this term, but I haven't been doing anything with Roman comedy in a long time, I'm ashamed to say. So I don't remember, in what sense do you mean?
In the sense that, let's assume it's middle comedy anyway, where Plautus goes.
Yeah.
In the sense that at least that play takes out an aspect of what you are working on here and turns it into a tool to generate comical situations.
Yeah, the gods in comedy, I think, I don't know. The thing is, I think also in Roman comedy, you're dealing with a whole completely different beast. I think what's also suggestive, just generally thinking about these terms, the way that they work in Greek drama, is also that the fact that these performances are inscribed in this sort of larger festival context. So there's also that fascinating thing. I don't recall what's happening with Plautus, but I think. Because you have also in Aristophanes, there are certain gods who appear. Obviously Dionysus himself in Frogs, and Hermes at the end of Wealth. But I think I'm trying to think. Because I was actually thinking in terms of in teaching this course this semester. There were a couple of students who were interested generally in the divine in Aristophanes and just thinking about types of gods that appear there, and they tend to be these sort of liminal, or these not one of the top 12 appear in comedy, and so it just suggests about sort of how far can you go about to laughing at gods. Dionysus, of course, is something about him and his, you can laugh at him. This is all, and he does. And Heracles, there are certain gods that take that kind of embody this sort of unusual nature that can invite laughter. And I think Dionysus as a comic buffoon is something we also find in other fragments of Cratinus and Eupolis, but I don't know. I'm sorry. I have to say it's been a long time since I read Plautus, so I don't really remember what's going on in the play. But I think generally, I think Epiphany generally. I think it is suggestive to think about it in terms of instability. And I know there's a new book actually about Epiphany that was just published today. No, seriously. And I was, because when I heard about it, I was trying to get a hold of it. Then I was like, oh no, because I was looking through, Google makes available their preview thing, and I did the search within the text about Dioscuri. And the author seems to suggest that in the 5th century there were various staged epiphanies of the Dioscuri in Sparta. Sort of ones that people knew were fake. These sort of military interventions. So I'm fascinated. But then Google wouldn't let me see the page. So no. I think there's something there, and especially now that I know that in the 5th century there were these staged epiphanies. There is something unstable about the whole thing. I obviously have been focusing about sort of literary representations, which themselves are also unstable in different ways. But I think it's
your reference to the Frogs is in a way the very good one that the gods can stage or can hide
Yeah.
their epiphanies.
Yeah.
Also suddenly
Yeah.
disguises as miracles.
Mhm.
So what do we see? And so on.
No, absolutely.
Okay, thank you. I think we need to call it here. Well,
Thank you. Thank you. Have all these papers.
Arrangements.
Sure. Yeah, great, no problem.